Hello, everyone, and welcome back to War and Literature English 1120. I'm Tim Wilson. This is lecture 14, and tonight we're going to have an introduction to the second half of the course. So the first half of the course covered ancient literature, namely the works of Homer and Virgil, and the second half of the course will be covering the modern era. We'll be looking at William Shakespeare and Virginia Woolf. Tonight, in particular, we'll be looking at Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, as a representative of this revolution in thinking that led to the modern era. So let's get started. And I'll call up the PowerPoint presentation that will guide us through. In terms of an outline of what we'll talk about tonight, we'll do a bit of an overview, remind ourselves what we've covered so far in the class. So what have we said about war? What have we said about literature? And in particular, what did the ancients have to say about the relation of the two? And then before we talk about the modern revolution, we'll cover the gap in what we haven't discussed directly in looking at the Middle Ages. So what was going on in the Middle Ages between the authors that we looked at, Homer and Virgil, and Shakespeare. So we'll see what could be called there this medieval synthesis of the Judeo-Christian and classical worldviews that the Middle Ages affected. Then we're going to look right at that modern revolution that I'm talking about that occurs around 1500, so a bit before, a bit after, that key point where basically the entire game changed. And we'll look at a few key sample events that happened in and around that date that give us a flavor of the shifts that were happening in the way people behaved and thought in the modern revolution. Then we're going to look at what, looking ahead, will be three waves of this modern revolution. So these three waves, it's a way of thinking about modernity, first articulated by Leo Strauss, a political philosopher, but I like to apply to literary, cultural history as well, in terms of trying to understand what has been the modern era. And then we'll finally get to Machiavelli, and so Machiavelli's part in that modern era. So as a recap, remember we said that war has been a part of human existence since our earliest beginnings, and this is as per the famous political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. It's not something that came along after, as far back as we go, and we look at other species, interspecies violence is prevalent, and manners of conflict is there as far back as we go. So too in the literature, as far back as we go in the literature, war is a prominent subject matter. It features prominently in the earliest Western epic, Homer, the earliest written literature we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it played an important part in the lives of people as early human societies developed, and how they articulated stories around that. So ancient literature, as we saw, finds certain positive meanings in war in different ways. So there's individual glory that we saw in the Iliad. There's how war can bring out and display piety or duty to family and community and to its historical destiny and social unity, as we saw in the Aeneid. But ancient literature also contributed to society's progressive achievements in limiting the scope of war in various ways. So there's limits to the rage, revenge, and grief that we saw in the Iliad, tied to the acceptance of mortality, and literature has always had that function of trying to get the audience to accept mortality. And then there's in Virgil's Aeneid, the famous passage we talked about in book 6, where Anchises, and Aeneas' father, proclaims that Roman mission, so to speak, which involves a certain empathy for the defeated, spare the defeated and break the proud in war. So So there's, on the one hand, in ancient literature, this way of finding glory, duty, both for the individual and for the historical destiny of a people, but also this way of seeing literature as contributing to social and institutional breaks on the excesses of war. So we'll see that with the modern revolution, so 1500 to the present, new perspectives on war and its meaning are going to be developed. And here, if we just want to take kind of in a chart view, one glance at what we'll see is we saw in Homer's Iliad, we saw the thematic being war and death, and the meaning in war being lasting glory. And then Virgil's Aeneid, we saw it being really around war and history, and meaning in war being in piety or duty. Then the Middle Ages, we didn't read a text by that, but if we were to read, let's say, Song of Roland or some medieval text that focused on war, there I think we would see as a general theme there this notion of war and divine justice or divine providence, and the meaning of war would be seen in how it contributed to this providential design. So all of that classical tradition, and so ancient and Middle Ages, assumes what we could say is a cosmic or divine centered view of war, and then, well, of existence as such, and war as one element of that. With the modern revolution, we see a shift in that perspective to a very human-centered perspective. So with the first wave, we'll see this in William Shakespeare's Henry V, war becomes, at least in that work, the major thematic becomes war and the modern regime. So how do we shape a modern political regime? And the meaning can be found in the Machiavellian design of the leader. Let's say the meaning of the war, the efficacy of the war. What is is it an effective war? Is it a good war? Can be found in whether or not the Machiavellian designs of the leader bear fruit. We're not going to look at any representatives, let's say, of the second wave of modernity, but if we were to look at 19th century texts, let's say the novels of Scott, then what we'd see there are war and human passions, and the meaning in war being a focus on the heroic leader as an emblem of the fate of a nation. So in the 19th century, we really get this sense of nationalism tied to the passions of individual creators and leaders. Then in the third wave, there's no faith in any of those things. All those faith in any of those grounds are basically lost, and we get kind of the war and fragmented experience that we're going to see in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and there's really a loss of meaning, or trauma is the experience of war. So now we'll go to the medieval synthesis, as I said before we get to the modern era. What's going on in those 1500 years between Virgil and Machiavelli and the other thinkers and actors who affected that modern revolution. So one way of thinking about what's going on in the Middle Ages, to remind ourselves, and this analogy I've always really liked, is that the Western tradition could be thought of as akin to a body. Okay, so it has two legs. One leg is providing that founding and that footing in the Greco-Roman classical tradition, and then one leg is providing a footing and a founding, a foundation, let us say, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So the torso would represent the Middle Ages and is where those two traditions come together. And that's what we're talking about right now, is that medieval synthesis. Then there are two arms that begin this kind of modern revolution, and that's the two arms kind of point back down to the feet, so to speak, each in their own way. So the Renaissance is this rebirth of classical learning. It points back to the Greek and Roman classical tradition to say, hey, let's not forget that, and let's try to reroot ourselves in that a bit more clearly. Then the Reformation tries to, again, in a different way, try to root itself more directly into the Judeo-Christian tradition as unfiltered by the torso, so to speak. And the head represents modernity per se, and let's say enlightened modernity focused on rationality. So the two legs then represent these differing traditions that are brought together in the Middle Ages, and we can sometimes forget about how different they are, and the different roots that they are, and that the West has brought together into this synthesis and into this organic unity that is a body in some way. And the two legs could be called, let's say, reason and revelation, or Athens and Jerusalem, and they've been called by various names, but what's going on there? So let's think about Athens and Jerusalem. So one way to have our point of departure is to think about in the Greek tradition, the Greek gods exist within a pre-existing and eternal cosmos, always subject to Moira, or fate. And the gods are knowable in human terms. So grounding, based on that, if you take that point of departure, grounding human life and determining the good will be a matter of coming to know the cosmos, so beings as a whole, as completely as possible. So the key will be, what can I know about these beings? And then philosophy, and then science arise as the Greeks' response to the human need to have a definitive account of the whole in order to guide our life. So it's almost a natural development from that point of departure where the cosmos is knowable, the gods are within that whole that is knowable. Now, the Hebrew tradition is quite different. So the divine name in the Hebrew tradition, Ehyah, Asher Ehyah, in Exodus 3:14, can be translated as I shall be what I shall be. So in Hebrew, the Greek verb can be present or future tense. So it can be translated, and most often is translated as I am what I am, or I am that I am, or I am. But I like this translation because it stresses this notion of the Hebrew God Yahweh as a God of will. I will be what I will be. You're not going to be able to pin me down and predict what will happen based on first principles or rationalization. Okay, so it's a God of will that can be opposed to this God of Abraham is sometimes opposed to the God of Aristotle. So for Aristotle, God is merely the first mover in a chain of causes, and we can kind of calculate principles about what that first cause is, so to speak. We can't know its entire perfection, etc., but the philosopher can make assumptions based on the nature of causes. The God of Abraham is a God of will, so it can't be knowable because it could assert a different direction in the future. So the Hebrew God stands outside the realm of beings. Remember, we said the Greek gods were within a pre-existing and eternal cosmos. The Hebrew God stands outside of the cosmos, creates it. So the cosmos has a beginning and end that is an act of willful creation by this deity. So the good life, if you take this point of departure, it seems to me consists of living in accordance with God's law or covenant. So we have a distinctive Judeo-Christian tradition based on law and covenant. We have this classical tradition started with the Greeks based on philosophy, science, human inquiry, let's say, reason. So religion in the Judeo-Christian tradition is this response to the human need to have a definitive account of our obligations under the law, or under the fulfilled law, the Christian sense of divine grace under Christ. So early on, in the Common Era, in early Christian communities, had this question, that they would pose to themselves. We have all this Greek learning that we're being taught, but I'm this converted Christian, or I'm deeply rooted in this Judeo-Christian tradition. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Well, why do I need to learn about that? And can we just get rid of it altogether? Should we just focus on these sacred texts that we know are true, and because they're products of the revealed word of God, according to these communities? So by posing this question, and Tertullian was the one to pose it in this way, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? They're basically asking the value of pagan learning, and what is the relation between, let's say, the human activity of reason or human rational inquiry in relation to revelation. So the other thing I'll just point out is that Christianity was in contact with pagan thought from its origins, given that Jesus lived in the Roman Empire and the entire New Testament was written in Greek, right? So, for instance, there's some evidence that that authors such as Luke and the anonymous author of the letter to the Hebrews were influenced by classical authors such as Thucydides and Plato. But by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians held radically different opinions about the relationship between classical and, so primarily Greek, and Christian revelation. So there were some that said we could still read Plato and others because they were Christians before Christ, they would say, because they had received a pre-revelation. Even before Christ arrived, they had received some sort of revelation, although they weren't quite able to articulate it. They articulated it in a blurry way, so you had to kind of sift through what they were saying to get the kernels of truth that were there. So for that reason, people could see, let's say, parallels between Platonic thinking and Christian dualistic thinking, Plato's dualism of matter and form, and Christian dualism between the body and spirit. These types of things seem to make sense, and maybe Plato was uttering, through a glass darkly, quote unquote, the kind of these truths that we could find, these Christian truths that we can find. So others would say that pagan learning is absolutely inferior, absolutely untrue, and useless. So let's dismiss it. Some, again, seeing some value in it, some dismissing it. So the medieval synthesis came where we say, okay, well, let's keep it, but keep it subordinate to to, let's say, the scriptural end of all learning. So great philosophers and other classical writers can tell people where they want to go, can tell people about the goal, but great philosophers cannot tell people how to get there and guide them. The only way to God is Christ, according to this medieval synthesis. And this is embodied, I think, very well in Dante's Divine Comedy, where he has Virgil, this classical author, guide him through the first 2 books, so through Inferno and Purgatory. And after Purgatory, at the summit of Purgatory, he must abandon Virgil as his guide. Virgil can take him no farther. And when it comes to paradise, the 3rd step, he needs Beatrice as his guide, this representative of Christian truth. So I've tried to, let's say, schematize a little bit more visually, as opposed to just metaphorically as a body, these 2 legs of the tradition, the Hebrew and the classical tradition. Already there was some synthesis, as I said, into early Christianity, but that synthesis was fully affected with medieval Christianity, St. Augustine, Boethius as the kind of primary figures there. And then with the Reformation and Renaissance, we have 2 of the movements of modernity. There are others that I'll point to as well. So the medieval cosmos is well, first of all, geocentric cosmos of Ptolemy and, of Aristotle, but perfected by Ptolemy, and the sublunary realm, so the realm below the moon. So in this diagram, it's below this gray portion. That's the sphere of the moon. So the sphere is the orbit. So the Earth is the center in this conception of the cosmos. And in this conception, there are certain heavenly bodies that circle around the Earth in a sphere that is a physical track, so to speak, upon which this heavenly body goes around. And the cosmos, as was understood, would consist of the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, a realm of fixed stars, and then this order of kind of the first mover, the crystalline sphere that is outside of that moves the entire motion. Now, the sublunary realm is a realm of change. So the realm below the moon consists of 4 elements: earth, water, air, fire, that move in straight lines and are subject to change. So earth and water move down, is their natural motion. Air and fire move upwards, they're lighter, that's their natural motion. The natural motion in the superlunary above the moon is circular. Things that are circular are perfect, they're eternal. So these things do not change and they move in circles, and that is their natural motion. They have a natural motion to move in circles. In the sublunary realm, things have a beginning and end, they move in lines, and it's a realm of impermanence. So what we have here in this visual is the medieval cosmos as depicted with Dante's underworld in it here. So it's there's the underworld here, a descent into hell, and Satan would have been in this final vestibule of hell. And then through that tunnel, and this is the middle of the earth, there's a tunnel that Dante takes to go to Mount Purgatory on the other side of the earth before ascending to paradise. So that's the cosmos, is this kind of sharp distinction between the eternal and the superlunary and the sublunary, which is impermanent, and it has kind of, again, it's a hierarchy to some degree of things that belong in their proper place, so to speak. It's the same with all the beings in that world. So all the beings within that world also inhabit what's been called a great chain of being. And this is, again, following Aristotle, but given a Christian sense in the Middle Ages. It involves a notion of there being a highest and perfect being, God, and then orders of angels, followed behind that by humans, and then animals of the air, animals of the earth and sea, plants, and then inanimate objects, rocks, what have you, right? So, and then beneath that, fallen angels and hell. So there's a hierarchy from what is most perfect and most in being, let's say most in most real, most perfect, most good, and then in all senses, as you descend that chain, things lack being, lack substance, are less permanent, less good, less true. And each thing has its station, each being has its station, again, like the medieval cosmos. It's not as though anything in the medieval cosmos is on a random track, kind of like our, let's say, modern physics of billiard balls almost, where bodies will be sent off onto different tracks based on gravitational pull or interaction with other bodies that deflects them into a different trajectory. There, things have their proper sphere. They have a natural motion within that sphere. So to here, beings have their proper position in terms of a great chain of being. Also, within orders of society in the Middle Ages, there are basically three orders to society. So the peasants are working, and that's their job, that's their function, and their role is to be the best worker they can be. And the knight has to perform their role and fight and be the best knight they can be. And then the priest has to pray and bring spiritual unity to the community, and they have to try to be the best priest they can be. And neither should attempt to fill the offices of the other, or else things will go awry. So what is the medieval? So that's medieval notion of the cosmos, of beings within the cosmos, of social order. Now, what did the Middle Ages think about war? So there's a tension between the classical world's glorification of war and the New Testament injunctions to pacifism. So this is a quote from Matthew chapter 5. If one strike thee on thy right cheek, turn to him also the other. So turn the other cheek is a simpler translation or short form of that you've probably heard, right? And there's also a tension between the New Testament, so the Christian New Testament, and what for Christians is the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, where God frequently orders the Israelites to undertake ruthless wars. So we should remind ourselves too that again, the ancient Hebrew God Yahweh is originally a Canaanite war deity. So there's a kind of before Hebrew monotheism, Yahweh was one God within a pantheon of Canaanite deities. It was a war deity, and we see, even in the Hebrew scriptures, celebrations of Yahweh's victories over the Egyptians during the Exodus, and we see celebrations of Yahweh leading their victories in conquering Canaan under Joshua in particular. So there are depictions of ruthless wars in the Hebrew Bible, and in God's injunctions to the Israelites to be ruthless with the inhabitants of Canaan in particular as they're settling in there. If the city resists, the Israelites are ordered, and this is Deuteronomy 20:11, you shall not leave a single soul alive. And then also, this is Deuteronomy, you must utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Now, we'll keep this in mind. So this is, they're going into Canaan, they're sieging cities there. And we'll keep it in mind in relation to what we'll see with Henry V and the siege of Harfleur. So that we have another siege opportunity there. And some people see Henry V's actions there, well, at least his speech there, not his actions, his speech there to be cold and ruthless. And another way of seeing it is to say that within a long tradition of just war theory, if a city holds out inordinately, and this long tradition goes back and roots itself a lot in Deuteronomy, you have every right to be ruthless with those people so that because of what they've risked the lives of those people, they've risked the lives of the seizures, the sieging army, what have you. So we have this tension between the New Testament and the classical tradition, which has a glorification of war and the glory and honor that can be found in war. Also a tension with the Old Testament, where it's less about individual glory, but about doing God's will, and God will often give commands to go to war, whereas in the New Testament we have injunctions to pacifism. So how do you bring these together? So the Middle Ages had to, that's a problem. And other examples from the Old Testament, Moses, carried out a massacre of the Israelites who had practiced idolatry in Exodus 32, and he was angry when the Israelites spared women and children and ordered them to kill all the prisoners except virgins who they could keep for themselves, and that's in Numbers. So again, this problem, what do we do? And St. Augustine was the medieval philosopher who first articulated the medieval synthesis when it came to war. So for Augustine, God treats his creatures in accordance with a larger providential design that we cannot see. So if someone is called upon, a leader is called upon to take their nation to war, it must be part of a divine design. So there's going to be bloodshed and evil, and those actions may seem to be against, let's say, Christian codes, but they're serving a larger aim. This is the synthesis in any case. So it was in this way that the Israelites were right to carry out God's commands. God's giving us a command. It's not for us to doubt that, right? God has a larger plan. Let's just go ahead with it, right? And then the other point about this is that the New Testament's injunctions to pacifism, to turn the other cheek and to be peaceful, are injunctions, says Augustine, to an inner attitude rather than to outward act. So try to keep charity in one's heart, even if forced because of one's social duty or because you're defending your city against attack. Even if you have to kill someone, remember you have to do it in a way that's directed to a charitable end. So both rulers and those who do military service in obedience to rulers have to avoid hatred and greed. So they can't be going to war out of hatred or greed, or even, let's say, the classical motivations of an Achilles to go out of a type of greed, a pride of, I've got to show that I'm the best, and that's my reason to go to war. That would not be the inner attitude that the Christian of the Middle Ages would say justifies one to go to war. It has to be out of a sense, it has to be motivated by a spirit of charity, that the war must be seen as a way to further God's ends. So helping in some way the enemy, maybe the enemy needs to be saved, right? So it sounds funny, but that's the way that Christian justifications of war sometimes go, or religious justifications generally, right, of war sometimes go, like that it's necessary to kill them to save them. Or it was a necessary action to save one's own community. So these people had to die, but it was saving a Christian community. It had to be done. It was part of God's broader plan, but there was no hatred or ill will to the others. It was done out of a spirit of charity, of trying to help others, whether that's one's own community or another community. So to summarize, the medieval worldview. So we have reason in the service of faith, or Athens serves Jerusalem. Okay, so that's how we solve that crisis there, that reason versus revelation, or Athens versus Jerusalem. It's fine, we'll have them both together, but they're in a hierarchy. Reason serves faith. We have a hierarchical cosmos where each thing and person has its proper station, a hierarchical cosmos, a hierarchical notion of entities in the cosmos, and a hierarchical notion of society. So each thing and each person within society has its proper station. And we see, as we just saw in relation to Augustine, war is just if it serves divine ends, not some sort of human greed or pride. So the modern revolution will overturn and reverse all of these assumptions. So we'll see that reason will have to be the ultimate arbiter of all decisions, and faith will have to be dispensed with as a way to make decisions about the good life, or how we belong together. We have a notion of the cosmos that is no longer hierarchical. It is, let's say, an abstract space with entities following no proper path, but are guided only by random motions and forces. And things do not necessarily have their own proper station, but can change through their own individual will. And war is just, in the modern kind of revolution, let us say, if it serves a human end. So there can be utilitarian justifications of war. So the historical context of the modern revolution. So I'm going to point to 7 key events, 7 key events or social movements or intellectual movements, we could say, that I really think over the space of 130 years really demonstrate the key shifts that brought about what we could call this modern revolution. Let's start with asking ourselves, first of all, what is modernity? So the fundamental way of thinking and behaving in the modern Western world for the last 500 years, so 1500 to the present, marked by secularism. All facets of existence are separated from a transcendent order. The progress of science, liberated from a theological framework. The progress of humanism and dignity and celebration of human life outside of divine will. And the progress of liberty and individual human rights. So political liberty expressed by democratic institutions, and economic liberty expressed by private property, free market economies. And so when we're talking about modernity, we have to always remember to distinguish it from what we'll be calling, or you may hear called already in different classes, modernism, which is an aesthetic movement of the first half of the 20th century. So we'll make that distinction between modernity, or the modern era, this broader social, cultural, intellectual movement of the last 500 years, from modernism and aesthetic movement, a narrow category, aesthetic movement of 50 years in the 20th century. So I said there's about 7 things I want to point to. The first one is the advent of linear perspective in visual arts. So before the Renaissance, artists made no attempt to create the illusion of depth and space. So we have an example on the right there. It's from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's a diptych of the Virgin of Humility, and on the left, and St. Jerome translating the Gospel of John on the right. So a couple of things to note here. So this is a typical medieval diptych. I picked this particular work because I happened to see this a few years ago. I was with my wife in Philadelphia, and I went and I was in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I saw this, and I said, oh, this is a perfect example of some of my points about medieval art. Okay, so I got this image and threw it into this slide, and so it brings back fond memories, all that to say. Now, a couple of things about the diptych. So the diptych as a form is a prevalent medieval form of visual art, and has two wooden panels that are bound together with kind of a either leather or sewn binding at the side. So it's almost like a book and can be folded open, such as you see here. And it's an interesting form because it suits very well the dualistic cosmic conception of the Middle Ages. The diptych reflects a dualism between the temporal and physical, and the spiritual and eternal. So in this particular one, the realm of the eternal, I think, is represented on the left, where we have the Virgin of Humility on the left, Mary with the baby Jesus in her lap. And this is timeless. These are images of Christian theological reverence, so to speak. And we have a saint, so a human who's definitely a great person, but has definitely lived a historical time, and is on the right, St. Jerome, and we have him writing the physical text. So in 2 ways we have a combination of the physical and the spiritual. So the spiritual on the left Jesus and Mary, and on the right, the physical Saint Jerome writing. We have on the left, Jesus representing the word of God in terms of the spirit of the word. And on the right, we have Jerome representing the word of God made flesh as text, so as physical object that we read. So we have that kind of juxtaposition of the spiritual and the physical in the form of the diptych and in the content in this case as well. And for the purposes of the point we're making here with respect to linear perspective, the importance of the artwork is more these kind of conceptual parallels of the idea than of trying to make this what we would call for us a realistic physical image. It's more about their spiritual analogies and conceptual dualisms, how they can refer to biblical truths, spiritual truths, as opposed to trying to physically depict in the illusion of linear perspective or the illusion of 3 dimensions, a physical world. That's not at all important to these artists, okay? So in 1413, Filippo Brunelleschi is credited with first introducing this method of linear perspective that we know and love in modern art, where we have this kind of geometrical calculation of a vanishing point in the middle of the painting to give things a certain depth. So unfortunately, his panels are lost, but the method spread widely and very quickly during the Renaissance. Now, what I want to point out that makes this very modern is that the point of departure of all art that takes this linear perspective approach is the privileged position, the central position of an individual viewing subject. So it's not as though the truth of what is represented is a timeless truth that can be shown through symbols and let's say dualisms. It's only true in as much as it appears true to the subject, the human subject viewing. You know what I mean? So before this, figures, there's no foreground, background. Figures can be to denote figures closer or further away. Certain objects were made larger because they were more important. That was about it, or for a symbolic significance. So here we can see a distinction between 2 crucifixion paintings. So on the left, we have a typical medieval depiction of the crucifixion. So there's no attempt to try to get depth there. Jesus is much taller just because Jesus is Jesus. And well, he's also on the cross. Jesus is taller here, but you can see that he's in the background, but still in the center of the painting, of course, and has kind of faded to the background because of the vanishing point there. We have figures in the front who are a little bit larger and wider, but their importance is still is emphasized as smaller by their diminutive stature. They're kneeling. Now, this is true. This becomes, let's say, a true painting. It becomes a true painting for us because it depicts the painting in a way that we can imagine we're seeing it, the individual subject, as opposed to the medieval painting is true, let us say, because it depicts symbols, motifs, themes of scriptural truths that we know are true. It's less about, let's say, the reality of viewing. So the second event I want to point to as significant, I won't go into this one in as much detail, but the fall of Constantinople. So in 1453, so this marks the end of the Byzantine Empire at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. And as the Byzantine Empire was really the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire, you could see this as the end of the Roman Empire. In fact, that's how in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he marks it with the end of the fall of the Byzantine Empire. So what is affected there is the migration of Byzantine scholars following the fall of Constantinople, and these Byzantine scholars to Italy, to other parts of the West, they contribute to this revival of Greek and Roman studies, and that led to Renaissance humanism directly. We wouldn't have the Renaissance, all these things that we were talking about, without the fall of Constantinople. The knowledge of Greek in the western half of what had been the Roman Empire had basically fallen to extremely rare that people would know Greek. So it was not copied anymore. Those texts were no longer copied. So Greek manuscripts were many Greek manuscripts were lost. A lot of what came over with this fall of Constantinople was the knowledge of Greek. A lot of the Greek texts that had been lost, a lot of Plato, knowledge of Plato, that quickly got translated into Latin with commentaries. Florence was a big hub of that. So an extremely important turning point for let's say generating Renaissance humanism, which developed into the scientific revolution and really got the ball rolling in Western Europe in terms of the types of advancements, let's say technological and scientific, that we talked about earlier in terms of modernity. So a year later, 1453 being Constantinople, 1454, Gutenberg produces or prints his first book, the Gutenberg Bible. This is the first book printed using movable type, of course, and with an ability to kind of mass produce books in that way. And it dramatically increased the accessibility and affordability of information and written knowledge. So if there's one thing I would say that we have to really, that is, I think, often overlooked or underestimated in terms of its importance, I would say this, the Gutenberg or the printing press. You mentioned the printing press. So there's a number of things that are going on there. First of all, just look at the stats here that we have at the bottom. So this is the European output of manuscripts. So manuscripts, handwritten scripts. So from 500 to 1500. For 1,000 years there. So each century we have a bit of increase, but let's say this order of magnitude is in the millions of texts being produced per century. And it's increasing as you know, especially beginning in the 12th century Renaissance. More people are beginning. It's called like a little mini Renaissance of the High Middle Ages. There's more people educated, more people doing this copying, but it's a limited production method. You've got people writing on. Well, let's back up here for a second. So when your method of transmission is the manuscript, the handwritten book, the socioeconomic factors that make knowledge so difficult to access and so precious are extremely evident. So let's say I'm producing the Bible, which is the text that was most produced, because you've got limited ability to replicate these texts, and you have to pick a few that are most important. So the Bible becomes the most important. So the Bible's a pretty long book. I'm going to be writing it out on a very expensive material, vellum. So animal hides that have been treated. So the material itself is expensive. It might take me 2 years to do it. So the labor and my labor, I'm one of only one in the community of few thousand that can do this kind of thing, let's say. So it's extremely rarefied labor pool that can even do it. So we're taking, in terms of the labor capital that's being invested in this particular output, is also extremely high. So materials are high, the labor output is high, and the actual productivity is low. So I can do one book per 2 years. So it's been said that we were to calculate it in today's dollars, that producing a book like that Bible would be the equivalent of $500,000. I've seen different estimates, but let's say it's around the price of a house now. So not everyone owns it. That's what I was saying. That's what makes it very rare. That can make knowledge, that can make access to knowledge extremely rarefied, because of the socioeconomic factors that need to go into its production and dissemination. So we have texts that are owned only by the rich, produced by the very, very few people that can write, and read by the very few people that can read. So we have the way to communicate this knowledge would be in a classroom. We would have a class. You wouldn't have the text. I would read it, and I would read to you my comments on it, or I would expound on the text that we read together. So the type of learning is communal there, okay? Now, when you have, as happened later on, especially in the 18th century, as the number of texts expanded and more people learned how to read, as I said, especially in the 18th century and the 19th century, then the relationship to the word becomes individual. So I can read alone, before going to bed or in the tub or something like that. People have an individual relationship with the text. I can develop, let's say, individual or idiosyncratic thoughts and experiences with that text, and that can spurn different ideas and innovations, so to speak. So that's one incredibly important shift, is the access to knowledge garnered by the fact that so many more texts are being produced. The mode of relationship to the text, the fact that it now becomes individual as opposed to communal. Therefore, as I said, sparking idiosyncratic individual interpretations and ideas. To get a sense, I'll go back to the numbers here of the order of magnitude shift. So here we're in the order of magnitude of millions of manuscripts, and then on the right-hand side we have European output of printed books. So we go from around 5 million in the 15th century to immediately an increase of 40 times, over 200 million. And here the scale is in the hundreds of millions. So by the 18th century, nearly a billion printed books produced every century. So the order of magnitude shifts incredibly. And now think, of course, for us today, right, we have the same kind of shift that's going on. In fact, in the history of communications technologies, there are these several communications technology shifts that have coincided with shifts in thinking and culture at those times. And there's a great book about this called The Presence of the Word by Walter Jackson Ong. Highly recommend that book. But he makes the similar point to this about, we go from an oral culture represented by Homer, let's say, as one example of an author that we could think about in that mode of communication, an oral culture. And here, how do we think about self, and how do we think about ourself in relation to the word, the knowledge that we're looking at? It's in relationship to the cosmic whole, as we talked about, in relationship to Homer. And then with the manuscript, in this case, the scroll in ancient Rome and Greece, we have, and one author we looked at there would be Virgil. We have this self and the higher order of the community. Remember, the manuscript as scroll still meant a relationship to a communal order of the word. Not everyone can afford those scrolls or read those scrolls. And then with the codex, so that's manuscripts instead of a scroll, the book as we know it, that folds open with stitched pages. We have this kind of dualism like we see with the diptych, just in the form. The dualism of the codex recto and verso, the dualism of the physical and spiritual, that's reflected by that. And then with the printing press, we have this kind of advent of the modern sovereign individual developed because of this new relationship to the word. So we have to ask ourselves, I guess, post 2000, where, that was the mode, the printing press, let's say from 1500 to 2000. Arguably, we're moving to new modes, obviously, of communication technologies. Books are still around, but and may still be produced for a while, but definitely communication as such is produced, consumed digitally. What does that mean, for our notion of self, our notion of relationships to the word as knowledge, and how is that going to shift or potentially create, let's say, a new cultural epoch? Stay tuned. There's not a lot of clear answers to that question. So the next shift I want to point to is the voyages of quote unquote discovery. Of course, Columbus discovered the New World, but of course it had been discovered by indigenous peoples before that, of course, who were already living there. But from the European perspective, this changed quite a bit. The voyages of Columbus were followed by those of Amerigo Vespucci and referred to in Thomas More's Utopia, if you want to read that work. So what it means for the West is vast quantities of raw material for industrial expansion, as well as colonial expansion, and as well as examples of cultures, different cultures that are deemed to be outside of the quote unquote civilizing effects of Western traditions of Christianity and classical learning. So they're confronted with, say, a different notion of what came to be known for them as natural humanity. So humanity outside of that, and started questions about, okay, what is nature of humanity outside of learning? So that became a big question in the Enlightenment then, so what is the nature of humanity? What is the benefit or detriment of arts and learning? And Rousseau, of course, picked that up after in his first discourse on arts and learning. So modern warfare, this is obviously the term that's most pertinent for this course. And I picked a year of 1494. This is a campaign of Charles VIII of France. We could pick others, but this is, let's say, the first modern use of cannon in an extended campaign and to a devastating effect. So it's as good as point as any to mark the beginning of modern warfare. And it was used by a couple of people that I've seen in histories of modern warfare, including someone I'll refer to later, Max Boot, in this in his work on that. So cannon as a war technology was used in China as early as the 12th century of the Common Era. In Western Europe, by the 13th century, it was used in the 100 Years' War at the Battle of Crécy. But the first effective use was by Charles VIII, as I mentioned, in this campaign in Italy against the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and various Italian powers. So Charles VIII's position as King of France had just become more powerful because of the end of the 100 Years' War. And we're going to look at the 100 Years' War in relationship to Henry V. So the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, which is the climax of Henry V, is a major battle in this 100 Years' War that fought between England and France. So the end of that 100 Years' War, France regains a lot of territory as England had dithered it away under Henry VI. So he's managed to secure his power. He also has this French technology of cannon technology that has advanced throughout the course of the 1400s. They had better material, molded bronze, using techniques from casting church bells, better ammunition. So they were using solid iron cannonballs for the first time, as opposed to others had used stone and different weaker metals. Better, more concentrated gunpowder, so better propellant. And these cannons were more mobile, so they had a system of wheeled carriages that were more effective than previous cannons. So they were able, for the first time, able to deploy cannons in a campaign effectively. Oh, so I'll just go back here and show you. This is kind of the map of, and this is from War Made New. This is that book by Max Boot. This is a map of the campaign that he took. You can see down to Florence here, to Rome, to San Giovanni, and to Naples. And we'll talk about how his stops along the way here, and the terror that he raged on Italy as he just swept everyone aside. So Charles' forces met the Neapolitan forces who were occupying the castle at Mordano. And in the past, you know, if you're in a castle, these medieval castle walls could hold out for months. But here, the castle walls were breached in 3 hours, and the French slaughtered all the citizens inside. And then when he got to Florence, Piero de' Medici surrendered the city and allowed them to take it uncontested. And then the French walked into Rome, and then the most powerful Italian state, the Kingdom of Naples, and then the French attacked the fortress at Monte San Giovanni, which had once withstood a 7-year siege. And the French breached the walls in 8 hours and slayed everyone inside. So more than 700 Neapolitans died compared to only 10 Frenchmen. So this gives you kind of a flavor. Well, first of all, the brutality of the war, but also the let's say the swift and effective, almost blitzkrieg type warfare that the French were able to effect because they had a new technology that had yet to find let's say, the corresponding defense technology. So I said like blitzkrieg because it's just as the Germans had in World War II, they were able to combine armored units with effective artillery and air support to create points of exploitation and advance. And they hadn't really figured out a defense to that yet. Of course, that developed in World War II. People were able to find ways of more effectively defending against that. But at first, for the first years of the war, it just meant that France fell in a month, and the Russians had lost after the invasion in 41. There's such a deep advance into Russian territory, almost getting to Moscow. So too here, cannon, when first effectively used, so let's say gunpowder more generally, when first effectively used against the older forms of defense, say medieval castles, cities, city walls, were proved extremely effective, of course, proved that people could win wars that before had taken months and were inconclusive. They could do so extremely quickly. And it also had, in this case, an important social and political change, because so you see on the right a depiction of the later bastion fortifications or angular fortifications that were required to be effective defenses against cannon. Okay, so they're expensive to design and build. That and coming up with your own kind of cannon and gunpowder equipped army required the resources of a larger nation state. It's not a matter of just calling up a couple of knights who are responsible for getting their own armor, their own horse. So now we're constructing these types of fortifications and constructing cannon and equipping large numbers of troops with arquebuses or muskets requires the resources of a state. So the political effect is the solidification of the power of the heads of these states, monarchs, as opposed to in the Middle Ages, monarchs were de jure head of a nation of peoples, but in practice, they were jostling for power or for authority with local lords, dukes, what have you. So those dukes, lords would have their own people. They've got their own castles. It's not as though the king is going to be able to come in and use force to make them bow to the will of the monarch. The duke in question can hide behind their castle. They have their own forces. Maybe it's them and a couple of other dukes are actually threatening the monarch in question. Here we have a centralization of power beginning under the monarch, largely because of changes in warfare. One major reason being changes in the nature of warfare. So the next event I want to point to is Luther's 95 Theses. So the Protestant Reformation, 1517, Luther nails his famous 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. It's famous, as I said, because it's seen as the beginning of the Reformation. I'll just point out, I've always found it as a Renaissance literature scholar, always fascinating, the fact that he did this at Wittenberg, and two other famous literary figures later come from Wittenberg, or at least study in Wittenberg, Dr. Faustus and Hamlet. So Shakespeare's Hamlet and Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. So each in their own way have connections to let's say self-assertion of the Reformation. So the key ideas of the Reformation: sola fide, faith alone, not works. So contra medieval practices of selling indulgences, etc. So these would be ways of saying, okay, well, I'm going to try to shorten my time in purgatory by purchasing an indulgence now, or having others purchase indulgences from me that through some form of the clergy that will shorten my time or a relative's time in purgatory. And by doing this or doing that, or purchasing this or doing that right practice that the priest told me, I'm going to be good, as opposed to someone else who's not exactly following that practice. So those, let's say, those are trying to, find justification, so to speak, with God, with the divine, through works, through my own activities. So the Protestants were saying, no, it's only through one's faith. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you buy. It doesn't matter what the priest tells you to, how to genuflect that the priest said. It's only if you believe the right doctrine. It's only if you believe in God, in Christ, in the revealed word of the Bible there. So the other interesting point there is that Luther's Bible, Luther had his own translation of the Bible in German. He gets rid of the Epistle of James, because James, that epistle, emphasizes works as well as faith. So only faith, sola fide, sola scriptura. So only faith and only scripture. So we're only justified by Christ, not by human intermediaries. So this has to do, the first one has to do with our own, let's say, relationship to the divine in terms of our faith, but also the second one has to do with that individual relationship with God, but also is an indictment of the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the church. So we don't need all these human intermediaries of pope and archbishop and all these things. And again, highlights, as I said, the individual believer's experience. So it also means that elaborate systems of allegorical interpretation must be disposed of and literal interpretation emphasized. So there had been in the Middle Ages elaborate allegorical interpretations of the Bible to try to align what's said in the Old Testament with the New Testament, and the Reformation led to increasingly a literal interpretation of the Bible. So the last event I want to point to is this Copernican Revolution. Nicholas Copernicus publishes his on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres in 1543, and it replaces the well, as it's gradually adopted, it's not as though it happened overnight, but the geocentric model of the cosmos with a heliocentric model. Okay, and advancements in measurement and observation behind this model were made by Tycho Brahe and Kepler and Galileo. And here, and then, well, eventually all the motions of the heavenly bodies and earthly bodies were understood within one all-encompassing framework with the laws of motion articulated by Isaac Newton. So remember before how bodies would move up or down depending on their own nature. You know, rocks would go down because they're earth, and that's just the nature of things that are made of earth, and water would go down, but air would go up because that's its nature. And then the heavenly bodies would go around because that's their nature. So there's different movements for different natures. So Newton was the one who brought, let's say, all motion, both heavenly and earthly, into saying, no, all motion follows a few fundamental laws. Okay, so but things don't have a proper sphere anymore. So what's interesting is that things are simplified into one unified kind of mathematical formula, but things don't have distinctive natures or spheres anymore. So I won't read this, but the advent of the heliocentric notion of the cosmos meant, you know, a beginning of this disintegration of the notion that things have their proper place, you know, that there's the hierarchy of the cosmos, that there's hierarchy of beings, there's a hierarchy of the order of stations in society. And this is a fragment from a poem of John Donne's called Anatomy of the World, where he talks about, we see a disintegration of all relation. So just the first line you can see there, and new philosophy, let's say new natural philosophy, new study of the cosmos, calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out, that of the four elements, you know, fire being that one that's just on the border of the lunary, and the sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. So all these, we seem to be lost now in this cosmos, and there's a disintegration of relation, and 'tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. So that these lines here. So that's an example of, let's say, one type of intellectual reaction to this new way of thinking. It's revolutionary, and it's, you know, it's the entire cosmos, and the way of thinking about it has been changed. For one, it can be disruptive. It can make one doubt, okay, what can I ground, what gives one things meaning, what gives life meaning, what I had assumed that was true, what can I assume is true? These things no longer have the type of hierarchical beauty that they once had. Things seem to be falling apart. So I'm going to talk now about the three waves of modernity. So we talked about a number of turning points. We talked about the Middle Ages, what was that medieval synthesis and what that meant. A couple of turning points that have directed us into what we could call modernity. Now I'm going to talk about how there's really three waves of modernity that get us up to the present. We're not going to go into each of these waves in detail, but just to know that there are these three waves. Now, this concept was articulated by Leo Strauss, this modern political philosopher, and I invite you to check out his essay, The Three Waves of Modernity. It's a quite well-written short essay. But in the first wave, we have an abandonment of the pursuit of an end, or telos, to things. And because the natural world doesn't have its own proper end, then the natural world is offered up to human calculation as a means to humans' ends. And the key figures there are Machiavelli, Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, and Locke. Then in the second wave, history replaces nature as the standard for thinking about human existence. So things as they developed. So it's no longer that things have a nature, or let's say in essence, it's things develop and have a history, or they have a story and they kind of evolve. And it was in the second wave that we get a Darwin, so to speak, that has, let's say, the natural philosophy or the natural science of evolution, where it's kind of history in nature, so to speak. All things, including nature, change, evolve, and the standard of judging these developments is then a new telos provided by history itself. So there's an end of history, and the key figures there are Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel. So it's really those figures, I would say, that enable us to have a Darwin or these type of kind of a natural science of evolution. Then the third wave, so it became obvious with thinkers of the third wave that that historical developments and the new positing of standards would not end, and that the historical insight of changing standards is still assumed, but that there's no assumption that there's going to be an end to history. So this leads to kind of a relativism, or it's called a radical historicism, and the key figures there are Nietzsche and Heidegger. So here, if we're to kind of try to summarize all of what we were just saying there, so with the classical tradition, with the Greeks, the Romans, the Middle Ages, beings, all things, so humans, the earth, animals, the cosmos, the beings of the cosmos, are understood the nature as having a nature, as having a, in Greek, physis, and having a proper end, or telos, so a proper purpose, a proper function, okay? So things have a nature with a telos. So the famous example, if you use Aristotle as really, I think, the person really articulates this viewpoint the best, the classical notion of being, so to speak. So if you have a tree, an oak tree, you have certain properties of the oak tree. It is a substance, what have you, and you can see the potential for that within the acorn. So the acorn has a telos to develop its end as that oak tree. That's in its nature. It's part of its telos. So for humans, that's, for us, our humans, our end, our function, our telos is, can be thought of differently, but it's, for the classics, it's generally, humans are the political animal, the rational animal, so we're living up to our end if we use our reason, if we think we're good to one another, and we fulfill our duty to a community, to our family, these types of things. We're fulfilling our virtue, our end. So if we're a good Aeneas, you add to Aeneas some rationality, then you've kind of fulfilled some different dimensions there. In the first wave of modernity, things still have this nature, but we have to understand the nature of things outside of an end. Okay, so beings are open to manipulation; they can be directed to a new end. So, so here, I guess the short form would be: things have a nature without a telos. In the second wave of modernity, nature, or being, is replaced by history. So things don't have a nature, they have a history. And so this is understood as historicism, but that history has a telos, okay? So the history of society, of different human social evolution or intellectual evolution, as per Hegel or Marx, has a kind of perfect society and a perfect realization of the idea in its end, and that would mark, and it's only by that point that we can judge previous articulations. So there are historical developments, but we're not left in relativism, because we know, well, that one is the end, and that one is the best, and that's where we're aiming towards. So this is better than that, or this was okay for its time, But what it didn't have was this. It was okay, but it lacked that. That was a major, let's say, oversight on its part. Okay, so if we're looking back at previous stages, or if we're looking back at different worldviews of humans. Now, in the third wave, we still believe in the historical unfolding of different viewpoints, and that different societies and different socio-cultural, intellectual, material conditions will produce different worldviews. But now we don't believe any longer in this third wave that there is an end to the process, that a point from which we can judge these worldviews or these values, these notions, as better or worse. So we can't say, well, it's difficult for us to look back and say, well, these people were worse than that because they were closer to us. We end up doing it. We look at the past, like as a society, we look at the past. We take down statues. If that the figure being represented in that statue doesn't live up to today's ideals. But when viewed philosophically, we don't have a standard upon which to judge that. We don't have a standard upon which to make that judgment. So that's where we are today, is history without telos. So it's this point of radical historicism or relativism. So again, maybe just some of the terms, I'll just try to define some of the terms. That was a kind of short form of it, but if I were to define some of the terms, a telos is the end or the final cause of a thing. It's also the perfection of a thing. So it's tied to the notion of virtue. So the dignity of anything can also be seen as tied to its fulfillment of its excellence or its virtue. So arete in Greek. So the eye, for instance, only deserves the dignity of that name in as much as it can see. So sight is the excellence or virtue or proper functioning of the eye. So it's the telos of the eye. It's the final cause of the eye. It's the end of the eye. It's that for which eyes exist or were created. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about telos. So philosophy and the telos. So classical philosophy aimed to try to define the good of each thing. So the good of human existence, what it was, the good life, and wisdom concerned the quest for causes, and the final cause, understanding this good, was the ultimate. The why, the good of each thing, is the ultimate philosophical point of wisdom. Classical philosophy, as a political philosophy, as a branch of philosophy, then seeks wisdom concerning the political things as an articulation of the ends of political life, or how we ought to live. So classical political philosophy then took as its point of departure considerations of the best political order, the best way to live. In the modern age, so we've gotten rid of ends. So the point of departure of modern thinking, and Machiavelli starts this off, is to try to reverse that point of classical political philosophy. So rather than starting from ends, that things have a final cause, an end, a good. And why would we try to dispense with that? Well, Machiavelli is basically saying, I think you could say, is that, well, people have been arguing about this for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and it hasn't furthered us at all. So let's lower the standards, so to speak, and we'll get rid of this notion of that how things ought to be, and let's look at how things are. Okay, and let's use that to try to an understanding of how things are, to figure out where we want to go, what our end is, as opposed to what, let's say, the ought to be as some sort of transcendentally posited goal. So modern political rationality assumes that ends are best left to individuals to determine themselves. And this is what gives them their freedom. And the role of the state or society is to ensure that individuals have the means to achieve their individual ends. So that's the assumption of liberalism. So that's the point of departure of modern liberalism, let's say. And in practice, this means we could say this would be a conservative critique of modern liberalism. Would be that it's, in practice, it means that we can't have intelligent conversations about ends any longer. Because we can't say, okay, well, that's my end, and I'm going to judge your end because that's going to be your goal. Your goal is to do this, and you think that's the best life. This is my goal. This is my best life. We're just going to get into arguments with no ground. It's going to be, one of those ones where we say, okay, yeah, best to just agree to disagree. In polite conversation, polite dinner parties, they always say, don't talk about religion or politics, right? Because it's about individual ends there. So what you do talk about are economics. You talk about means. You talk about ends. The ends themselves have to be left to individuals. And what happens then is the only things that we can have as a basis of communal dialogue are the means to ends. Okay, so this is, as I said, would be a conservative critique of modern liberalism. And what that means too for education is that rather than education of an individual to their end, their virtue, right? And education is drawing them out, drawing them along to their proper end. Education is now an accreditation, giving them the accreditation they need for the means to their own end. So Machiavelli, a key figure in all of this that we're talking about, has been called the first modern man. So he writes The Prince in 1513, after being expelled from political service with the rise of the Medici family in Florence. And the question of Machiavelli's overall vision. So people who know the Prince think, okay, well, he's obviously doesn't believe in, democracy or any of those ideals. He just believes in rule by a strong individual with no moral compunction to be slowed down by thinking about whether or not this is the good act, only think about whether or not this is expedient. Now, there's some truth to that in Machiavelli in The Prince, but he wrote a number of other great books, including, I would strongly recommend you read The Discourses. So The Discourses, it's very clear that his preferred mode of government is a republican government. So it's discourses on Livy. So Livy's an ancient Roman historian, writing just before Virgil's Aeneid. And so Livy is writing the history of the Roman Republic. And Machiavelli is trying to learn profoundly about what is it that made the Roman Republic so great, and how can we bring back that type of republican mode of government. For Machiavelli, there's a need to return to the virtues of the classical Roman republican government, because he feels that that's what's the critical element that's missing. There's institutions that are missing, but there's also the spirit of the people. You need to have a spirit of people who fiercely want to be independent, fiercely want to be free, want to rule themselves as opposed to be ruled from a distance. But first, he feels we need a strong prince. So the prince is basically, his blueprint. The prince is a lot of things, but in some ways you could say it's what he thinks Italy needs first to lay the groundwork for the type of republican government he felt was needed. And the other point you get from Machiavelli is this notion that Christianity had softened humanity. So it now lacks the strength to be, it lacks the strength to produce great leaders and great individuals that you require for a free republican citizenry. So for Machiavelli, as I kind of tried to allude to this before, the attempts to account for the ends of humanity, the goal of humanity within the political community had been unrealistic and misguided. And the notion that humanity has an excellence or a virtue that is proper to it must be abandoned. So for Machiavelli, there's this important word, virtue, or virtue has a new sense for Machiavelli, rather than this notion of virtue as we see here as a proper excellence, proper to one's communal behavior. It's this kind of new sense of virtue as self-actualization and power and manifestation. So Machiavelli, you could say, consciously lowers the standards of social action. So he lowers the standards such that the actualization of these standards is more possible. So more in accordance with that aspect of fortune that can be shaped by human willing. So in doing so, he set out to destroy the classical and the biblical foundations of political philosophy in order to clear a way for a new stable foundation for modern politics and political philosophy. So in back to the theme of our course, the standards of action in war, for instance, is a good example of what he's talking about. The standards of action in war are lowered. It's not a question anymore of determining whether or not the proposed war is right. It's not just war theory in that sense. And it's not in the sense of determining whether or not it's in accordance with divine justice or providential design. Rather, the war is right. This is a new modern notion of just war, if it advances the overall human designs, right, of the Machiavellian leader. So it's a just war if it does that, if it does so most efficiently. Here's a quote from chapter 25 of The Prince about the relationship to fortune that I think speaks volumes. So Machiavelli says, "I compare fortune to one of those dangerous rivers that, when they become enraged, flood the plains, destroy trees and buildings, move earth from one place and deposit it in another. But this does not mean that, when the river is not in flood, men are unable to take precautions by means of dikes and dams, so that when it rises next time, it will either not overflow its banks, or if it does, its force will not be so uncontrolled or damaging." So fortune is this force that, or fortuna, can be shaped within limits by a certain human virtue. And this is a new sense of virtue that I mentioned. It's not classical virtue. Virtue is no longer one's own proper end that I haven't decided. It's not as though I decided my end in the classical notion of telos or virtue. It's what is proper, what has been given to me, and how do I live up to what has been given. Rather, here, virtue is now considered the active power of self-determination. How do I shape things such that they go in accordance with my will? Just a quick note on the influence of the Prince. So he has a reputation as the teacher of evil during the Renaissance, in the 16th, early 17th century, especially. We have the Machiavel as a character type in Renaissance drama. There's Shakespeare. We have Iago and Richard III. Christopher Marlowe. We have a character named Machiavel in The Jew of Malta. And there he says, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance." He says that in the prologue. But Machiavelli's Republican writings were a source for the founders of the American Republic. So there's a complex relation there. So especially at the beginning there in the 16th century, somewhat of a mixed response. Machiavel, character in drama, Machiavelli seen as short form for kind of, let's say, anti-Christian sentiment. And thus it's difficult to explicitly come out and say that you support some of the ideas. But I want to make a point when we get to Shakespeare's Henry V, that Shakespeare, I think, is taking a page out of Machiavelli's book. It's not just demonizing the Machiavellian ideas as a Machiavel evil character. He's saying that there is some wisdom in this for modern political regimes. And I think we'll see Henry V as this type of Machiavellian modern leader when we start to look at Shakespeare's Henry V next week. Until then, have a good week.